Welcome, glad you're here. Today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be covering our second last learning plan together, learning plan 11. And this is probably of the remaining two, the one that gives you a little bit of thinking to do, but it's not difficult by any means. What we're going to be doing in this learning plan is we're going to be talking about the immune system. In general AAP, we talked about the lymphatic system, and I talk about the difference between the lymphatic system and the immune system. And the difference between the lymphatic and the immune system is kind of like the difference between us and the house that we live in. So the lymphatic system is where the immune system lives and works. So that's kind of what we're going to go in today. We're going to investigate the components of the immune system, the things that provide us with our immunity, that protects us from pathogens and other things that are foreign to the body. So what we're going to do today is we're going to investigate the different ways that our body protects itself from pathogens that might be harmful, potentially harmful. We're going to look at the different components of the immune system, what those are, what they do, how they work, and then we're going to get a little bit of detail as far as the inner workings of them and how they differentiate from each other, what one does versus the other, and how some are similar and how some are different. So we're just going to look at all different aspects of the immune system to give you a better understanding of what components are in the body that help the body protect itself. That's really what it's all about. So if we start off looking at a really nice picture that's actually in your book, it's this picture right here, and it kind of gives us a breakdown of what we're going to be talking about today. And if we look first of all at this picture up here, we have what are called surface barriers. So these are intact structures that provide our body with protection. It's kind of like a wall that walls off the internal aspect of our body from the external. So things like our skin and our mucous membranes. So because the skin has many different layers to it, it's basically this physical barrier. So someone could cough or sneeze or do whatever onto our skin. We wash the skin off. For the most part, we're okay. So the skin provides a really nice barrier. It's a physical barrier to microorganisms and the toxins and their enzymes. We also have, in areas that are open to the external environment, we have mucous membranes. So we find mucous membranes are going to be lining our nasal cavities, our respiratory cavities, our mouth, the rest of the alimentary tract. These are all mucous membranes. They are membranes that are exposed to the exterior environment. So they do provide us with an additional physical barrier, but it's not as rock solid as the skin, because obviously anything that enters our body and makes way into or past these mucous membranes, there is a possibility that the pathogens can penetrate through the mucous membranes and infect the body. So the skin is the physical barrier. We have an additional physical barrier with the mucous membranes, but it's not as effective as the skin. And then we also have something that's not listed here on this diagram, but it's referenced in your notes. We also have protective chemicals of the epithelial tissues. So, for example, some places on our skin, we secrete an acidic type of secretion, because bacteria and other pathogens don't necessarily like environments with a low pH that's acidic. So that is an antimicrobial approach from our body to kind of inhibit bacterial growth, if you will. Our body also produces enzymes to destroy microorganisms. We also have the mucin in the mucus, which kind of like provides us with a sticky trap. So when you're breathing air into your lungs, for example, that air is going to cross over those mucous membranes, and those mucous membranes are made up of pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue, which produces mucus. and then the pathogens and the pollutants and the various structures stick to the mucus to keep it from entering the body. So that's another way that our body protects itself. We have antimicrobial peptides, which are protein derivatives, and other regional secretions. So we have essentially these surface barriers and the secretions of the surface barriers. Now, we consider these surface barriers to be one of our body's innate defenses. And what we mean by innate defenses is that you're born with these. So when you're born with skin, you're born with mucous membranes, you're born with the secretions of those surface barriers. You don't have to acquire them. You don't have to develop them. They're there. They're working for you from day one. So the surface barriers are basically like the first line of defense. It's like the external wall. But in the event that, if you think about an invasion, if you will, let's say that you have this enemy that's trying to penetrate and get through the external wall of a kingdom. If they get past that external wall, now you're going to need an army, so to speak. You're going to need actual beings that are there on the front lines to fight off the intruder. And so if we look at the surface barrier as that external wall, we look at the next one down, the internal defenses, as sort of like the soldiers, the fighters. These are the things that are going to be there if we get a breach of the first line of defense. So this is our second line of defense. This is our internal defense, but these are non-specific. So these are available to each and every one of us as long as we're healthy and normal. And these are specific agents that target pathogens that are foreign to the body and will go after them to neutralize them, to destroy them, or to break them apart, or do whatever. Maybe slow them down or what have you. So these are the internal defenses. And you can see 5 of them are listed here. We have phagocytes, we have natural killer cells, we have the process of inflammation, we have antimicrobial proteins, and we have fever. So we're going to talk about each of these a little bit as we move forward so we can investigate what they are and what they do. So the first thing we're going to look at are the phagocytes. Now, phagocytes are basically a name given to a group of structures within the body that perform a similar function. So a phagocyte is not a reference to a specific structure. It's more like a reference to a category of structures that all do the same thing. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like calling a dog a dog, but there are different types of dogs, right? You have a Rottweiler, you can have a Collie, you can have a Poodle, you can have whatever. They're all in the dog category, even though they differ slightly. Same thing with a phagocyte. A phagocyte is a name given to a category of structures that all do basically the same thing. So you can see here in your notes, it references neutrophils and macrophages as being phagocytes. So they both can perform phagocytosis, which is what you see on the screen here. And what a phagocyte does is it confronts a microorganism that gets through the external barrier. So what it does, if you look at this picture and you follow the 5 steps, what you're going to see is that the phagocyte is first of all going to stick to the pathogen or a piece of the pathogen. We're going to talk about what we call an antigen presenting cell later. So sometimes it's the organism itself. Maybe it's a fragment of I shouldn't say the organism. Maybe it's the pathogen itself. Maybe it's a fragment of the pathogen. Maybe it's just a part of it. But whatever it is, the phagocyte is going to kind of stick to it It's going to come up to it and adhere to it. It's going to stick to it. And then what it's going to do is it's going to reach out these little pseudopods, these little arms, and it's going to draw that pathogen or the fragment into itself. And it's going to form a little pocket. And that pocket is called a phagosome or a phagocytic vesicle. Now, within this phagocyte, there are digestive components called lysosomes. And so what happens is once we form that little pocket, that little phagosome, that little phagocytic vesicle, what happens is we take that lysosome and we merge it with the phagosome. Now it's called a phagolysosome. Now, within that lysosome, we have hydrolase enzymes. It's like acidic. It's an enzyme that breaks apart the pathogen. So those enzymes are going to digest the particles, leaving residual bodies. But these residual bodies have no negative effect on the body. They're going to neutralize, basically break it apart. They're going to break it into its small pieces. It's just indigestible and it's residual, and the body eventually will reabsorb it and eliminate it or do whatever. So it neutralizes the pathogen or the fragment of the pathogen by breaking it apart. So the way that these do it is a little bit different. The one we see here on the screen is more along the lines of what the neutrophil does. But we also have this idea of coating the pathogen with a protein called an opsonin so that it can be engulfed. So we want to make sure that we understand that that's a step that comes a little bit before it's going to be engulfing. So that is the phagocyte. That's one of the body's defenses. We also have natural killer cells. And I don't have a diagram here for natural killer cells because natural killer cells are basically non-specific equals of what we're going to discuss later, which are the cytotoxic T cells. So when we get to that portion where we're talking about specific immunity, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the cytotoxic T cells, and I want you to understand that the cytotoxic T cells are the same as the natural killer cells, just that the cytotoxic T cells are specific to a certain pathogen. So what the natural killer cells do is they basically kill, it says in the notes, cancer cells. It can also kill virally infected cells before the adaptive immune system has been activated. So what the natural killer cells do is they basically go around and do checks, random screenings of the cells that it comes into contact with. Can I see your ID, please? Okay, you belong here. Can I see your ID, please? You belong here, you're fine. Can I see your ID? You don't belong here. So then what it does is it destroys the cell. Now, the way that it works, just so you understand, the way that natural killer cells work and the way that these cytotoxic T cells work is that they will not kill the virus itself. So let's say we have a cell, a virally infected cell. The natural killer cell, the cytotoxic T cell, it does not kill the virus. But what it does is it kills the place that it lives. It kills the cell. Because a virus needs the cell's own pieces in order to manufacture more viruses. It's kind of like if someone were to come into a factory that produces a product and say, you're not going to make your product anymore. What you're going to do is you're going to make what I tell you to make. Kind of hijacks the reproductive capabilities of the cell. So the virus comes into the cell and says, you're not going to make more of you. You're not going to work to repair yourself and to fix yourself. And to reproduce yourself, what you're going to do is you're going to make a bunch of clones of me. So what the cytotoxic T cell does, what the natural killer cell does, is it kills the cell. So it basically robs the virus of the materials that the virus needs in order to make more viruses. But if there are any viruses that are already created, those viruses are released. But what you're doing is you're sort of blowing up the house that they live in. So it'd be like if you had a building, for example, you got a bunch of drug dealers squatting in the building. You basically destroy the building. Now the drug dealers that are in that building now go running all over the place. Now police go chasing after them, and they can catch some of them. That's kind of the idea here with the natural killer cells and the cytotoxic T cells. You're not going to get, you're not killing the actual drug dealers, but what you're doing is you're destroying the place where they're residing. Does that make sense? So that's kind of what these cells do. And we'll talk about the different mechanisms by which they do that when we get to the cytotoxic T cells. It works the same for both. It's just that the natural killer cells are not specific, whereas the cytotoxic T cells are specific. So just so you understand that. All right, moving on. Okay, the next thing in your notes that we talk about is inflammation. And inflammation is going to occur anytime body tissues are injured by either physical trauma, intense heat, irritating chemicals, infection by viruses, fungi, bacteria, you name it. All right, so inflammation is a process by which your body, number one, prepares itself to heal itself. Number two, it's trying to produce an environment that deters further development or further proliferation of the pathogen. So it's going to kind of do those two things at the same time. So what we see here is that we have what we call the 4 cardinal signs of acute inflammation. So if you follow this graph down what's happening here, when a tissue is damaged, when it's injured, first thing we're going to do is we're going to release inflammatory chemicals. And those inflammatory chemicals are going to expand the blood vessels. And when it does that, it increases the spaces between the cells that make up those blood vessels. So then it allows the things like the neutrophils and the monocytes and the lymphocytes to be able to make their way through those slots. So the leukocytes are going to migrate, and then they're going to cling to the walls, and then they're going to pass through the walls, and then they're going to start to perform their phagocytosis. Now, if they start to go through the phagocytosis and they start to eat up and engulf and destroy these pathogens, what they're going to do is they're going to leave the debris behind, and that debris we call pus. The debris and then the dead white blood cells that are left behind after they die off. So we're clearing the area of debris. But what we're going to see, because the arterioles are dilating and because the cells are being more permeable, what we're going to see is you're going to see two things. We're going to see more blood flowing to that area because we're trying to flush out the area. We're trying to clean it out. We're trying to clear it out. But because the blood carries with it heat, you're going to see that that area becomes warmer. That's one of the cardinal signs of inflammation, heat. It feels warmer. And because of the increased blood has a red color to it, so it's going to appear to be a little bit more red or pink. But that's beneficial. The heat is beneficial because that increases the metabolic rate of the cells so that it helps the tissues repair themselves faster. But as these arterioles dilate and we get more fluid in that tissue, what you're going to see is that that area might be a little bit more tender, a little bit more painful. Number one, because there was physical damage, so you might have damaged some nerves You might have activated some or stimulated some nociceptors, but also when you're stretching the tissues, coupled with the damaged tissues, that's going to be a little bit pain. This is going to be a little painful. So the third cardinal sign of inflammation is pain. And because we have more fluid in the tissues, that tissue is also swollen. So anytime we see tissue injury and we see responsive inflammation as a result, we're likely to see these four cardinal signs of inflammation: heat, redness, pain, and swelling. So your first attendance term for today is the term inflammation. So this picture does a really nice job of showing you what the white blood cells do and how they get to the area of potential infection. So what we see, number one, the leukocytes are going to be making their way to the area of damage. They're going to be attracted by those inflammatory chemicals. Kind of like blood in the water when you got sharks. Sharks come, they're drawn to the blood in the water. So the leukocytes, the white blood cells, in this case, the neutrophils, remember neutrophils can be phagocytes, the neutrophils come to the area. And what they do is they start to stick to the wall of the blood vessel, and then they sort of flatten out. And then because we have more fluid in this blood vessel, the spaces between the cells expand, allowing space for the neutrophil, in this case, to squeeze through the cells in that wall, and then it travels to the site of injury, damage. Now we see that there's like a pin or a nail or whatever that has penetrated into the dermis of the skin, and on that you see some rod bacilli bacteria. So there's a bacterial infection here. So we see now the neutrophil starts to perform phagocytosis to neutralize the bacteria in this area. So as those bacteria are neutralized, the remnants of that, along with the white blood cells, as they start to die off, they kind of hang out in that area. And if you get enough of that going on, then you get the formation of what we call pus. So related to inflammation are the chemicals that may be released to aid in the process of inflammation. We have chemicals such as histamines. That histamines are going to be released in response to actual physical mechanical injury of the tissues. We have kinins that can be released. We have prostaglandins that can be released. We have the complement system, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and we also have cytokines. So these are all things that can be released when there's damage to tissues or to aid in the inflammation process. So in summary, this table, I'm still not done. We still got to talk about antimicrobial proteins and fever. But what we're seeing here, I'm just injecting it here, is this really nice table, which gives you a nice summary of the innate body defenses. So we have the intact skin, intact mucous membranes, and that gives you the components of these body defenses and tells you what they are and what their mechanism is. Now let me jump down to fever, because we have it on the screen here first, and then we'll talk about the complement system next. But if you look in your notes, you'll see that we talk about fever right at the bottom of page 2. So we have something that's produced by the leukocytes and the macrophages called pyrogens. And when they get released into the body's fluids, in the blood specifically, they trigger a change in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is what regulates our body temperature. And so when these pyrogens get to the hypothalamus, it's going to say to the hypothalamus, hey, we need to increase body temperature. And so we get an increase of body temperature. Now, the reason why we have fever is because it makes the pathogens uncomfortable. I mean, fever makes us uncomfortable as living beings. We don't like it. It doesn't feel good. And that's because it's not in the ideal range as far as homeostatic function. Our body's cells don't like it. It denatures proteins. It's hard on the cells. It's hard on the body, but it's also hard on the pathogens. So fever is the body's natural way of trying to stem the proliferation of a certain pathogen. So it's trying to keep the body's infectious process from advancing. So finally, we back up to letter D on page 2. I'm talking about the antimicrobial proteins. Now, there are two different ways that the antimicrobial proteins can enhance our defenses. One of them is through the interferon mechanism, and we see the interferon mechanism here. It's a pretty remarkable mechanism of how it works. So the way that the interferon mechanism works is, if we have a viral infection, what we're going to see is that we have a virus. That virus is going to enter the cell. Now, this cell is a lost cause. This is a cell that's been hijacked. This is the factory that's been taken over. Hello, I'm Mr. Virus. I'm taking over this factory, which is a cell, and you are going to do what I say. You're going to make what I tell you to make. Okay? Or, like someone coming in the bank, robbing the bank. Guess what? That robber is going to rob the bank. Unless you try to become a hero, which if you work at a bank, they'll tell you never try to be a hero, just give the person what they want. This cell is a lost cause. It's going to be infected. It's going to be killed. It's a lost cause. However, what the cell does when it gets infected is it turns on a set of genes, switches them on, and these are called interferon genes. And what it does is it makes a messenger RNA for interferon, and then the body, through its protein synthesis mechanisms, will produce interferon molecules. And so it releases these molecules into the environment. So it's kind of like when the bank robber comes into the bank and says, give me all your money. Well, underneath the desk, the teller has a little button that it pushes. And the robber doesn't know that the person's pushing the button because it doesn't make any sound, doesn't lock the door, doesn't do anything. It just It's a silent indicator that there's a robbery going on, but it alerts the authorities to the fact that there's a robbery going on. And so then the police will notify other banks, other businesses in the area. There's been a robbery. Make sure you lock your doors. Don't let anybody come in. So that's what happens here. So when the host cell that's infected by the virus, it releases its interferon molecules. Those molecules are going to bind to receptors on the same type of cell in the general vicinity, saying, you better lock your doors. There's a virus coming around. And you got to make sure that you don't let it in. So when the interferon binds to the receptor, it prompts the cell to create an antiviral messenger RNA, which then produces antiviral proteins, and it stops the virus dead in its tracks so that the virus cannot infect that cell. It's a pretty ingenious strategy. It's pretty cool. So this is the interferon mechanism. So I'd encourage you, like I said, to think of it as a bank robbery. Robber comes in, we activate the signal saying, hey, there's a robbery going on here, letting the other cells know that there's a virus. Okay, so then the cell blocks viral reproduction. This is the interferon mechanism. Some of the drug therapies out there use this. They'll inject a person with an interferon to help slow the progression of a certain thing. Is it a cure? No. But it's designed to introduce to the body these interferons that bind to cells that block the invasion or the reproduction of something, or blocking the synthesis of something within the cells, or whatever. It's designed to help block the cells and stop the cells from doing something that you don't want them to do. That's your second term. Okay. The other antimicrobial protein method that our body has is called the complement system. Now, the complement system basically refers to these proteins that are normally found in the blood at all times, but they're inactive. They don't do anything. Okay, so they're just floating around in the blood. They're plasma proteins. But when we have an activation of the complement system through one of these three pathways we see at the top, what we're going to see is that these proteins become active and start doing things. So if we look at the top, we have the classical pathway. So if we have an infection of the body and antibodies respond by clumping and attaching to that target cell, that's going to activate the complement system. Okay. We also have what's called a lectin pathway. So if there's a microorganism that's introduced to the body, and that microorganism on its surface has certain carbohydrate markers or sugars, so to speak, that's going to activate the lectin pathway. Or we have the alternative pathway. Normally on our cells, we have inhibitors that say, don't go into the complement pathway. Don't do it. But on the microorganisms, that inhibitor is gone. It's not there. That signal to say, don't do this, is not there. So when our body's immune system is coming around and checking things, and our body's immune agents or what have you, the inhibitors are going to be gone. And it allows for this complement process to proceed. So what we see here when we do activate it in one of these three ways is that we have complement proteins that are going to be activated. And we start all of them with the C. C stands for complement, and they're given numbers. So we have C3, we have C5, we have C6, C7, C8, C9. We don't see a C4 on this particular picture, but we've got all these different complements that are just given different labels. So what we see here, number one, and this is not something that you have to memorize. I just want you to understand the basis and what's going on here. Okay, I just want you to understand the concept. So we have the complement 3, for example. And complement 3, what it's going to do is it's going to fragment. It's going to break into two different segments. And what you're going to see is that the B segment is going to coat the pathogen surface. Remember we talked about this? Phagocytosis. The first thing is the phagocyte comes up and then it coats the outside of the pathogen so it can engulf it, right? So the complement protein is going to help with that. We also have complement 3A, the fragment complement 3A, that's going to help enhance inflammation. It's going to stimulate the release of inflammatory chemicals. C3b is also going to start to form a chain with some other complement parts. C5 and C6 and C7, C8 and C9. And what it's going to do is it's going to form this chain. Okay, so I'm going to form this chain. But then what I'm going to, it's kind of like taking a chain of, or like a string of beads, and then you're going to take this one and you're going to bring it around and attach it to this one. So what you're going to do is you're going to form a ring. So now you have something that looks like this, right? So what you see is that we drive these complements into the wall of the infected cell. Poke a hole in the wall of the cell, so to speak. Create a pore. Lyse the cell. We burst the cell. We break it. Like popping a balloon. Pop. Now remember, if there are infectious agents in the cell, it's not going to kill those infectious agents, but it stops the use of that cell for that infectious agent's purposes, right? So if this is a cell that's infected with a virus, if we pop the cell, the virus doesn't get much use out of that cell anymore. Now the virus is there. It's like, okay, well, I lost this cell. Goes try to find another cell. But if we've got the interferon mechanism active, it's going to make it hard for that virus to travel to another cell to infect it, right? So you can see that these antimicrobial proteins are helping our bodies deter the proliferation of the pathogens through a variety of different ways. The interferon mechanism, which we just talked about before. We also have the complement system. So we're going to see inflammation occurring, and that helps deter the progression of the pathogen. We also see that we're going to enhance phagocytosis through the complement system, and we're going to poke a hole in the side of the cell. The membrane of the cell, we're going to poke a hole, making it less likely that the cell can be used for purposes of the pathogen.
Like the biggest part of
the question was, is this the biggest part of the whole healing system?
I mean, the fact all the other parts.
That's it. That's exactly it. It's called complement because it's complementing other processes that are occurring within the body. So you find that the body fights pathogens in a way that's unified. You have different things that are all happening at the same time with a common objective, which is eradicating and neutralizing and eliminating the pathogen. So things just don't happen by themselves. The complement is going to help out the phagocytes. It's going to enhance inflammation. It's going to help with it's going to help the antibodies, which are part of the specific defense. It's also going to help the natural killer cells. It's going to help the T cells. So the complement system is one of the pieces of the puzzle in the whole picture of defending your body from pathogens. So I wouldn't say it's like a huge component of it, but it is a significant piece of it. Does that make sense? So it's one of the pieces of the puzzle. If you think about it, like a military, you know, you have the Navy and you have the Marines and you have the Army, you have the Coast Guard. You got all these different parts of the military. That's kind of like our body's immune system. Each one has kind of its own job to do and a certain area that it defends. One is you know, the Air Force defends the air, one defends the seas, one defends the land. Kind of like here you see, well, the complement system is sort of like the supportive structure. So we need to make sure that we have the right vehicles for the military. So we're going to provide with the vehicles they need, or we need the proper aircraft or the proper watercraft. So the complement system is sort of like the back scenes stuff that's kind of supporting the work of the military, so to speak.
So when somebody has like an autoimmune,
If someone has an autoimmune disease, it's not necessarily this one. Not to say that this can't happen, but it's not the trigger. The trigger is going to be the specific adaptive defenses that we're going to get to next. That's where it's going to be, where the body's adaptive defenses that are designed to go after specific pathogens, those pathogens are going after the body instead. And we're going to look at that because, let me just get out of here. What we're going to see is that the T cells specifically that are designed to go after foreign cells, when they're in the thymus, they're supposed to be tested. They're supposed to be tested to make sure they go through a set of 2 different tests. And they're supposed to make sure that they recognize the body's own antigens, and then they don't attack the body's own cells. And somewhere in an autoimmune disease, so to speak, that testing mechanism is flawed, where for some reason these T cells, instead of being inactivated when they go after the body's own tissues or cells, they're not. And so they're there, and now they're attacking their own structures. Yeah. So we'll get into that after, or we're going to take a break. So after the break, we'll start talking about the adaptive defenses, and then we'll talk about that testing process, and then we can discuss that, how it relates to that. All right. Okay, we'll take 10. So come back about 5 after 10, and then we'll pick up from there.
because I took
There we go. All right. All right, so we, up to this point, we've looked at the non-specific defenses. Now what we're going to do is we're going to spend some time looking at what we call the adaptive defenses. These are the defenses within the body that are specific to a particular pathogen, that our body trains to go after specific things. And what we see is that the way that our body looks for these pathogens is by doing identification checks. So we're checking name tags. So if you think back to when we talked about blood types, we talked about the ABO blood group and also the RH blood group. So when we say someone's B positive, it means that they have the B antigen and they also are positive for the RH antigen. So our body's immune system will look at a red blood cell and say, "Can I see your ID, please?" And it looks for the antigens. And if it doesn't match, then your body's immune system is going to attack that. That's why you have to be careful you don't take someone who has B positive blood and introduce A positive, for example, because the body's antibodies that are in the plasma of the blood are going to attack the antigens, or I should say bind to the antigens that are on that cell, treating it treating it as if it were foreign. So that's the general premise here of the adaptive defenses. So the ABO blood group is an example of how our body's adaptive defenses may work if we have incompatibility of blood types. That's our adaptive defense going to work. Specifically, the ones that reside in the fluids of the body, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So when we look at page 3, right at the top, number 3, antigens, it really comes down to sensitivity and awareness of antigens. And so our adaptive defenses are designed to look at specific antigens, and when they don't belong in the body, they go after that. They go after the carrier of the antigen, or they destroy the antigen itself. The other thing is, if we detect an antigen in one place of the body, it's going to notify the entire body system, the entire body itself, all the systems. So it's not just a localized response, it's a systemic response. Because the idea is, if we're finding it here, we might find it other places. Very similar to when we have a terrorist threat. You think back to anytime there's an attack by terrorists, what's the first thing we do? We say, oh, well, it could happen here, right? It could happen here, it could happen there, it could happen. So if a terrorist attack takes place on a train, now we're looking at all the train stations. If it takes place on an airplane, now we're looking at all the airplanes, right? So it's systemic. We're looking at the entire body and saying, hey, if we've got an infection here, we've got an antigen that doesn't belong here, there's a chance that it might be somewhere else in the body. So the body comes at it with a full attack from the entire body system. I shouldn't say body system, but when I'm talking about the entire body as a body system, not a system proper like the immune system or skeletal system like that. The other thing about the immune system is it has memory. It remembers previous attacks and it prepares for them. So the idea is that we might get caught with our pants down, so to speak, the first time we're attacked by a pathogen, but because our body builds memory or has memory of that attack, the next time that pathogen is introduced to the body, we have a much swifter and a much more profound attack and a response to that pathogen to neutralize it. That's why immunizations are used. Because when you immunize someone, what you're doing is you're introducing either a weak or a dead pathogen to the body, and you introduce it to the body's immune system and say, hey, this is what's out there. And then the body's immune system says, hey, I don't recognize you, so we've got to build our immunity to this pathogen. And so it mounts a delayed response, a small response, but because the pathogen is either dead or weak, it really doesn't have an effect on the body. Sometimes, depending on you might feel a little sick. That's the body's immune response to it. But the idea behind the immunization is that the next time the person is introduced, now for real, to that pathogen, it gets squashed before you even consciously sense anything is going on, because the secondary response is so much more powerful. That's the theory behind an immunization, relying on the body's immune system. So we have two different types of immunity that we're concerned with. And you see those listed in your notes under letter A, numbers 4 and 5. The first one is the humoral immunity. And when we talk about humoral immunity, it has to do with immunity in the body's fluids. The old term, the archaic term for the body's fluids is called the body's humors. So it's no surprise then that we call this humoral immunity, because it has to do with the body's humors. We saw this before, I think, when we talked about, I can't remember what the concept was, but we talked about it, humoral and neurogenic.
Endocrine system.
Yeah, the endocrine system. Yeah, so we had a humoral activation, right? A humoral stimulus. That was exactly it. So it has to do with body's fluid. So same thing here. We have humoral immunity. It's the immunity that occurs within the body's fluids. And the players in the body's humoral immunity are what we call the B cells. So in the body's attempt to stem off any sort of infection that might occur within the body's fluids, our B cells are being active in that. So those are the ones that are active when we're thinking about blood types, ABO. So if you take a red blood cell that doesn't belong there and you drop it into the plasma, into the fluid of someone who, let's say they're a type B ABO blood group, and you drop a type A red blood cell into that, now you're going to get a response from the body's humoral immune system, or part of the, or I should say, the humoral division of the immune system. So what you've done now is you've activated, or you've caused a response from the antibodies that are secreted by the B cells that are in the body's fluids. So we'll look at that in a little bit. And then we also have cellular immunity, and this is cell-to-cell combat, like the natural killer cells. So if you have an infected cell, the natural killer cell, or in this case now it's going to be the T cells, the cytotoxic T cells are going to attack. They're going to latch on to the infected cell, and they're going to destroy that infected cell. That's cell-to-cell combat. That's what we call cellular immunity. And so we're going to look at both of those as we move on here today. So when it comes to getting the immune system going, to activating the immune system, it comes down to antigens, like I said. And so as it says in your notes, antigens are substances that can mobilize the immune system and provoke an immune response. So we have different types of antigens that can, or different aspects of the antigens that can cause an immune response. We have number one, the complete antigen. So the complete antigen can stimulate a specific lymphocyte and antibody, and it can react with the activated lymphocyte and antibody. Okay, so a complete antigen can stimulate the immune response by itself. Okay, so you've got the complete antigen, full-on immune response. If we have what's called a hapten, it's an incomplete antigen, so it's only part of the antigen, and it doesn't stimulate the entire immune response at all, but what it does is it interacts with the body in a way that kind of puts the body on alert, saying, something suspicious here, and we might want to just keep an eye on it, okay? So it's kind of like suspicious activity, kind of checks out, you know, it's like a fake ID. It's kind of like, I don't know, your ID looks okay, but I don't know, there's something that's not right, okay? So that's like the hapten. Now, what it comes down to is on the antigen itself, there's what's called an antigenic determinant. There's an aspect of the antigen that will interact with the body's immune system. So for example, if it's in the fluids, the antigenic determinant is going to latch onto a certain part that's specific to an antibody. It's like lock and key. It's going to fit exactly. Or if it has to do with a cell, it'll bind to an activated lymphocyte. Okay, so the T lymphocyte is what we call the T cell. So the lymphocytes. So we have the B lymphocytes, we have the T lymphocytes, B cell, T cell. So when you see the term lymphocyte, understand that that's like the T cell or B cell lymphocyte. T lymphocyte, B lymphocyte. So these antigenic determinants are going to trigger, or they're going to cause a reaction within the body's immune system. And then finally, what we have to compare and contrast that to is the body's self-antigens. So kind of like what we had finished our first part of our discussion today on, before the break, looking at your body's own antigens and realizing that, hey, you and I are on the same team. You know, we're part of the same body here. So those are the self-antigens, and you want to make sure that the immune system doesn't have a response to the body's self-antigens. And when it does, that's what we'll consider like an autoimmune response. The body's own immune system is attacking itself and destroying parts of the body. So what we do is we call that major histocompatibility complex. It's a set of proteins that are on the surface of the cell that says, hey, I'm a good guy. I'm one of you. We're on the same team. We're on the same side. Okay. And so the body's immune system is going to look at these antigenic markers to determine whether it belongs or doesn't belong. And if it doesn't belong, it's going to trigger a response by the immune system. So looking at this picture in your book, what we're seeing here is the antigen itself. So this is the antigen. But you can see that on the antigen are certain aspects or sites. These are called antigenic determinants. You sitting here, it's probably easy if you look at that screen rather than the one I'm drawing on, because the colors kind of blend together here. You can see on this picture, we've got like almost like a triangular shape for the antigenic determinant. This one is more like a circular shape, and then this one is that. There. Okay, so these are the antigenic determinants. These are the things that are going to prompt the immune response. It's not the antigen itself, but it's what does the antigen look like? How what's coming off of? What are the characteristics and qualities of the antigen as far as how it interacts? So you've got these antibodies, and if you've got an antibody that fits onto one of these antigenic determinants, kind of like a lock and key, it kind of fits right in. That's going to allow that antibody to latch on to the antigen to neutralize it. So this is what would happen if you take a type A red blood cell and put it in the plasma of a person with type B blood. The antigenic determinant on that red blood cell would fit on the anti-A antibodies in that person's plasma, and so the antibodies would clump around that red blood cell, neutralizing it. Agglutination, they call it. So making that red blood cell less mobile, so it can't move around. Now, the antibodies don't know whether this is a bacteria or whether it's something that might be moving around or trying to reproduce. All it knows is that the antibody fits on the antigen. Okay, so it doesn't care if it's a red blood cell that has no intention of infecting your body or reproducing or anything like that. It doesn't care. Does it fit? Boom, it's done. Okay, so just keep that in mind. that it will affect something that locks in with the antigenic determinant the exact same way, no matter what it is, no matter what the foreign particle is. All right, so the cells of the adaptive immune system, I mentioned before already, we have two different types of lymphocytes. They're all born in the red bone marrow. So we have B cells and T cells, also called B and T lymphocytes. They're born in the bone marrow. But they get educated in two different places. So it's really easy to figure out which one goes where. So the B lymphocytes stay in the bone marrow. Bone, B cells. T cells travel to the thymus. T cell trained in the thymus. And so while they're in these specific places, they mature. So what happens is they go to school, they become educated. They are developing into cells that go after specific pathogens. As it says in the notes, the B lymphocyte selection process is not well understood. So what that means is determining which B cells will function normally and correctly when presented with a foreign pathogen and which ones will not, and basically eliminating or destroying or inactivating those. T cells go through a selection process, and I'm going to go through that in just a little bit, but what I want to do is I want to finish off this diagram first, okay, so you understand what happens. Okay, so after they get trained in the thymus and the bone marrow, and they become immunocompetent, they know what to do. So they went to school, they got trained, they passed their tests, now they are ready to go. What they will do is they will be released into the body. We call it the seeding. So we seed the secondary lymphoid organs in the circulation. So they're immunocompetent. They're ready to go. They're ready to go after someone, but they're naive. They haven't been exposed to a pathogen yet. See? So they're like, okay, I'm ready. I'm ready for action. It's kind of like a policeman. We've taught the policeman what to look for, what to do, but they haven't engaged the enemy yet. Or the military. You know, they train the military. They know what to do. They know what to do when they get in that situation. But they have not encountered the enemy yet. They're naive. But they are planted in the lymph nodes and in the blood to be on the lookout for anything that doesn't match. And then, once they encounter the antigen, now they become activated. They said, this is what the training was for. Now I know what I need to do. I need to go after you because I was trained and I passed my tests and I know what to do. And so what happens is we get an activation of the immune response. And so the lymphocytes become activated, they proliferate, they multiply, and then they go to work. And then we keep some memory cells around in case we ever encounter them again. That's essentially what happens from the beginning. So they're born in the bone marrow, they travel to the thymus or they stay in the bone marrow for their education when they mature. Then after they receive their education, they go out into the workforce and they are looking out for the antigens. And when they encounter that, they become active and then they do the work. All right, so as promised, let's talk about how we educate the T cells and how we test them. So we have two different tests that these T cells have to go through in order to be recognized as immunocompetent. And let me tell you, 70% of them fail. So of all the T cells that your body produces, 70% of them don't meet the mark. 70% of them either get killed off or they get inactivated. All right, so the first step in the thymus is the testing grounds. This is like practice, where it can't hurt your body. We're gonna practice here. So what happens is we need to figure out if the T cell recognizes the self protein. All right? So what we're looking at here is this structure right here. So on the thymus cell, we're looking at this little part here. So as a T cell develops, what we want to make sure is that this part matches this part. You see how I kind of wrote over it, but if you look in your book, you can see how this is not a match, right? You can see that? This bottom part is kind of pointy, where here it's squared off. So it's not a match. This is an example of a T cell that's developing that doesn't recognize the body's own proteins. And this is really important. Because a T cell has to bind to the self MHC proteins in order to become active. All right? So it has to be able to do this. If it does, if it fits, then we go on to the next step, which is negative selection. What we want is that the cell does not recognize its self-antigen. It doesn't want to fit tightly like this. They're showing how this is a really tight fit. See how there's no white space? Here there's kind of white space there. Here there's white space. So what we want is we don't want a tight bind. We don't want a tight bond formed here. We want to lock into that self MHC, but we don't want the body to look at the self antigen and say, that's a bad guy. See, that's what we don't want. So let me explain how this might work in a little bit different way, so it kind of helps you understand what we're looking at here. Okay, so I use this example every semester because I guess it's relatable. Okay, so this is the way that the body's immune system is supposed to work. Number one, the body needs to recognize that, let's say that I am a cell in the thymus. I'm an antigen presenting cell, okay, of the thymus. First of all, if you are a T cell that's going to school, you have to be able to recognize that I am on the same team as you, okay? So you need to, let's say that we're American soldiers, okay? You need to recognize that I'm a fellow American soldier versus a member of the Taliban, okay? Or you could say ISIS now, I guess. But you need to be able to recognize that I'm on the same side as you, okay? That's what you need to recognize. And if you don't recognize that, then you can't be in the military. If you're going to look at me and shoot me and kill me, and you're going to kill your own fellow soldiers, then that doesn't work, okay? So you're not in. You don't make the cut. If you understand that we're on the same team, now the next step is this. I'm going to hold up a picture. And it's going to be a picture of me, my face. And I say, hey, look at me. I'm a bad guy. And you look at the picture and you say, come on, Victor, you're just holding up a picture of yourself. Come on. Let's not be fooled. Or I hold up a picture of any American soldier and say, hey, look at me, I'm a bad guy. And you look at me and you say, come on, come on. You're just holding up a picture. It's you holding up a picture of whatever. Okay. What you want is for me to hold up a picture of Osama bin Laden and say, this is the guy that I saw doing something bad, and you need to go after him. Okay? And so you see the picture, you say, okay, this is the guy we're looking for, let's go find him. Does that make sense? That's what you want your body's immune system to do. Say, Victor, I understand it's you, one of us, the soldiers, holding up a picture of the bad guy, telling me this is the guy you have to go after. And not shooting me, thinking that because I'm holding up the picture of the bad guy that I'm the bad guy. See? You want to make sure your body's immune system doesn't go, holy cow, it's Osama bin Laden, and then shoot yourself or shoot your fellow soldier because he's holding up a picture of the bad guy. That's what you don't want. When that happens, that's an autoimmune response. When you're holding up a picture and they're like, oh, there's a bad guy, bam, and you shoot. See, that's what's happening. Your body's cells are going out into the body, going throughout the body, your body's immune cells, and looking at your own body's cells and saying, bad guy, bad guy, bad guy, bad guy. And they start killing off their own body's cells. See, does that make sense? So that's what you want your body's immune system to do, to recognize you're one of the same team, and then also recognize when they're holding up a picture saying this is a picture of the person we're going after. Go after them, okay? And so I am what we call an antigen presenting cell. I am a picture presenting entity that says this is what I found. Or maybe at the site of a terrorist attack, I find a shoe left behind or something like that, and I say, okay, I found this shoe. This comes from the bad guy. Let's look for the guy who owns this shoe. So I'm holding up a piece of the bad guy so that you know what we're looking for. See what I mean? So that's what we call an antigen presenting cell. We have several different cells that can perform as antigen presenting cells. And so it's important to make sure that we understand what the body's immune system needs to do and what it needs to avoid doing in order to properly protect your body. All right, moving on. Okay, so an example of an antigen presenting cell, and just so you know where I am, I'm on page 4, letter B, talking about the antigen presenting cells. The antigen presenting cells activate the T cells. They're the ones that are going to get the T cells to go, okay, let's go get them. And there are different types of cells that can be antigen presenting cells. A dendritic cell is one example of an antigen presenting cell. Your notes, you see number 2 under letter B, a macrophage can be an antigen presenting cell. And even number 3, B cells can be antigen presenting cells. So the dendritic cells have contact with the external environment. So they might phagocytose an antigen coming from the external environment and then bringing it to the inside of the body and presenting it to T cells. So this might be, for example, a cell that might be located within the mucous membranes, for example. Comes into contact with something that you breathe in, and then it takes that antigen or a piece of the antigen from that pathogen, brings it to the lymphoid organ, and it says, this is what we got to look out for. And then the T cells say, okay, we'll go after it. We'll make sure. Okay. Macrophages are found in the lymphoid organs and connective tissues. So when the macrophages present cells, they activate the T cells. And then the T cell is going to say, hey, thanks for showing us. Now I'm going to give you permission to go after anything that carries this antigen. So what the T cell does is it actually activates the macrophage so that the macrophage can engage in phagocytosis. So they're kind of like, say, this is what I found. What do you think? The T cell says, looks good. Looks like we need to go after it. Now go get them. And so then the macrophage becomes activated. B lymphocytes can present antigens to the helper T cells. And then when it presents it to the helper T cell then will tell the B cell that it can do its job. So it activates the B cell. It says, okay, time to secrete some antibodies. So you can see that these antigen presenting cells come in different forms and they do different things, but they all have a job to do, and that is to present fragments of the antigen to the body's immune cells so that they can either go after the pathogen or to activate something else to allow them to do their work. Right, so this is what we see with the B cells. This is our humoral immunity, remember. So initially, we have to have an encounter. Oops. We need to have an encounter with the antigen first, okay? Okay, so we have to have an encounter with the antigen first. Right, so we have an antigen. It binds to a specific receptor on the B cell, okay? So the B cell has little antennae on it, little receptors. Looking out for anything that can latch onto it. When that happens, we activate these B cells. The B cells say, oh, we got a match. And so now this, see, there's three of them. 1, 2, 3 different B cells here. This one, number 2, was specifically activated. So now we're going to say, okay, this is the one. We need to make more of these. So they start making clones of that particular B cell type. And so what we see happening then is that the activated B cells will differentiate into 2 different types. We'll see that the B cells will form plasma cells, or differentiate into plasma cells, and they'll also differentiate into memory cells. The memory cells are kept around so that the next time we have an encounter with that antigen, we get a much faster response. But now the plasma cells are going to release antibodies, and the antibodies are going to clump around whatever possesses the antigen to keep it from moving, okay? So if we ever get another response, even years later, now we have those memory cells, they become active, and now instead of just spewing out a few plasma cells, now we got a huge response. Tons of plasma cells that are released for a much more rapid response. So your third final attendance term is the term helper. We haven't gotten to the T cells yet, but in your book you have a table, table 21.3, that gives you an overview of both of the lymphocytes. You can see here that the primary targets of the B lymphocytes are what we call extracellular pathogens, things like bacteria, fungi, parasites, sometimes viruses that are found in the extracellular fluids. So these are things that are not infecting cells. They're hanging out in the body's fluids. whereas the T cells go after infected cells. Okay, so that's the difference. So again, looking at a different viewpoint when it comes to immunological memory, or first exposure, secondary exposure, or primary response, secondary response, this is why we do immunizations. See, because when you have exposure to a pathogen, let's say it's day 0 here, it takes about, I don't know, 4 or 5 days for your body's immune system to even start anything. And then when it does, it mounts some response, but it's not a significant response. We just don't have the firepower. We don't have the number of antibodies available to fight this pathogen as maybe we would like, kind of caught off guard. So this would be the immunization. You inject the person with the weak or killed pathogen, the body mounts an immune response, but doesn't amount to much. But let's say on day 28 now, so almost a month later, you get exposed to that same pathogen. Remember, it took us about 4 days to even do anything. You can see that starting right when the body is introduced to the pathogen, we see a response. And you can see that within about a day or two, we have a much, 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 much stronger response. So this is why we see immunizations as something that people opt for, that they do, because of this concept, to protect. There are different types of humoral immunity. Active and passive humoral immunity. We have a naturally acquired active immunity. So we become infected with whatever the pathogen is. Someone's sick, we get what they have. Our body mounts an immune response. The first response is not great, but now we've built the immunological memory. We actively acquire immunity artificially. That's through a vaccination. And we have passive immunity. Passive is naturally acquired when a mother will pass antibodies between her and the fetus when the fetus is inside of her, when she's pregnant. Or if she nurses the newborn and provides them with that colostrum, that immune cocktail, right when they're born. That's a naturally acquired passive immunity. Then we can also take passive immunity artificially and acquire artificially through the injection of antibodies. So if you get an injection called a gamma globulin injection, you're injecting the person with antibodies. So it's passive because the antibodies are not being produced, or they're not, the antibodies are not showing up in the person's body as a result of the secretion of that antibody from the plasma cells. You just took the product and then introduced them to the body. So the person's own body did not mount the immune response that allowed for the antibodies to be released. So over here, what you're doing is you're just taking the antibodies that were formed and passing them on. That's why I call it passive, because you're basically giving the antibodies, the end product, to the person, instead of allowing the person to develop them on their own. You're giving them like a little boost. So antibodies come in different varieties, but all the antibodies are common in that they have an antigen binding site, which you see here on the left side. We have an antigen binding site here and here. You can see that we have a heavy chain and a light chain. So, and they're held together by these disulfide bonds. So all antibodies have these common characteristics, but they come in different varieties. But this is what the antibodies do. When they encounter an antigen, they will do things. They're either going to neutralize the pathogen by masking the dangerous parts of the bacteria or virus, or they're going to agglutinate. They're going to stick to the cell, as in blood type incompatibility, or they'll engage in precipitation. They're also going to enhance phagocytosis and inflammation. You're also going to see that, remember that when the antigens bond to an antibody, that's going to activate the complement system, which will then lead to the cell lysis, poking a hole in the cell. So antibodies are involved in neutralizing, agglutinating, and precipitating, also activating the complement system. So here are the different types of immunoglobulins. We have IgM, we have IgA, and you can see what they kind of do here in the blue. So it activates the complement. Here we can see it's found in the saliva, sweat, intestinal juice, and milk, and it helps stop pathogens from attaching to epithelial cell surfaces. IgD, does here is a B cell antigen receptor. IgG is the most common antibody. It's the main antibody of second and late primary responses. It's going to fix and activate complement. IgE, you're going to see releases histamine, so this would be something like a allergic reaction, for example. So all the different types. Okay, we have a little bit more to go, but before we get into the T cells, because it's there's a little bit of involvement here, I just want to give you a kind of a brain break. And we'll again stop here. We'll take 10 minutes. And after the break, we'll come back, and then we'll look at the T8. I'm sorry, the T cells. I'm thinking of something else. So we'll come back and look at the T cells and investigate how they work, the difference between the helper T cells and the cytotoxic T cells and their roles, and then we'll pretty much call it a day. Okay? So we'll take a break, and we'll come back and talk about the T cells. Okay, so the last thing we have to go through is the what we call the cellular immune response. We're going to talk about the different types of T cells. So that takes us back to this diagram here. Whoops. Okay, so we have two different types of T cells that we're mainly concerned with. And it has to do with the type of what we call the glycoprotein that they display. So we have what's called a CD4 cell, which you see on the left side of this diagram, and then a CD8 cell. And you can see that they're going to respond to two different types of MHC protein. So the CD4 responds to the class 2, or I should say binds to the class 2 MHC, whereas the CD8 binds to the class 1 MHC. So the CD4 cells that you see on the left side are usually going to become helper cells, and they're called helper cells because they don't do anything directly themselves, but they help activate other cells. For example, they activate the B cells, they activate the T cells, they help activate macrophages, and some can moderate the immune response. Whereas the CD8 cells over here become, as you can see in the bottom on the right here, cytotoxic T cells that are going to destroy cells. They're going to do cell-on-cell combat. They're going to latch onto an infected cell and then tell that cell to destroy itself, or it will destroy the cell. So the class 1 MHC antigen, or I should say the class 1 MHC, they're found in all body cells except for the red blood cells. And it says way in the bottom of 5 and up to the top of page 6. And they display antigens synthesized from within the cell. So if you have a cell that is infected with a pathogen, then the antigen that would be presented will be coming from the class 1 MHC protein. So the antigen presenting cell is going to present the antigen of the infectious agent through the class 1 MHC protein. Whereas the class 2 MHCs are only found on cells that present antigens to CD4 cells. Okay, so not necessarily on the body cells. They can come from other places. All right, so as we said before, when we get the T cell to bind to something, it has to accomplish that double recognition process. All right. So first of all, if we look at this top picture here, what we're seeing here is that the dendritic cell in this case has to engulf the antigen, from this case from a bacteria. It's going to engulf it, and then it's going to push out a piece of that antigen and display it. So this is what we call the presenting of the antigen. So we're going to present it through a class 2 MHC protein in this case. So it's going to process it and it's going to display it. Now, in order for this to work, we have to have double recognition. Number one, the CD4 T cell has to recognize the MHC antigen complex, okay? So it has to recognize this part here, and when it does that, it's showing that through here, okay? It has to recognize that, and then it has a co-stimulatory molecule attached, and it has to bind here. So it has to basically lock in two places. And if we get it to lock in both places, now this cell will then form clones of itself. And then these cells are going to proliferate and help activate other cells, okay? So once we activate the CD4 cell, now this cell can go out and help other cells. Activate a B cell, activate a T cell, activate a macrophage, whatever, okay? And we also get the memory cells. But the key is it has to bind in these two places. And then when it binds, then it becomes activated. So helper T cells, once they're activated, can help out in different ways. So let's look at the helper T cell that's been activated. So when the helper T cell is activated, now it's going to go out and it's going to look for B cells. And the B cells are also going to produce the same antigen. They're going to say, hey, I found this bad guy. Did you see it? Yeah, I did. So the helper T cell comes along. Says, hey, there's a bad guy out there. Do you see him? Yeah, I see him. Is this him? Yeah, it's him. So what happens is we form a latch here. You're seeing that here. So the helper T cell CD4 protein latches onto the MHC complex of the B cell. And when that happens, the helper T cell is going to release chemicals and it's going to activate that B cell. And says, yep, that's the guy I saw too. So let's go after him. You go get him. Okay, good. So then the B cell now becomes activated. It can now make its plasma cells. It can release antibodies and so forth. Okay. Let's say that the helper T cell comes along and it wants to help in cellular immunity. All right. So first of all, the helper T cell needs to bind to the dendritic cell. Again, it's going to say, okay, this is the guy that I saw. Did you see him? Yes. Okay, is this it? Yes. So we form a bond here. We bind to the dendritic cell. When that happens, the T cell will tell the dendritic cell to release co-stimulatory molecules. Right here. Also going to, see, because it's already locking on here to the CD8 protein, but now it allows for this to lock in here. Because we need those two steps. We need to get the co-stimulatory molecule to lock in. So that's what it does. So the T cell binds to it and says, okay, dendritic cell, we have confirmation, so you can go ahead and lock on to the CD8 cell. So now the CD8 cell becomes active, and it becomes active also through the release of interleukin-2 from the helper T cell. So the helper T cell really is involved in, it's sort of like a double check. It's like, okay, we've got an infection, but we need to confirm that the infection has taken place. And so what the helper T cell does is, first of all, it becomes activated when it binds to the antigen presenting cell. But now the helper T cell will go to the B cells and to the dendritic cells or the antigen presenting cell that's attached to the CD8 cells to kind of give them confirmation to go ahead. It's kind of like, okay, yep, we just want to make sure. We're just double checking. Is everything good to go? Are we ready? Yes, go ahead. So the helper T cells really are sort of like a mediator to make sure that the body doesn't go into some sort of immune response without double checking. Okay? So like the helper T cell is kind of like the double checker. Does that make sense? So it just kind of helps things along, but make sure that it doesn't get carried away. So once we get the activation of the cytotoxic T cell, now the cytotoxic T cell is going to go around looking for cells that are infected. And so what it's going to do is it's going to lock onto an infected cell, and it's going to release perforin. And perforin is kind of like the complement system. Remember how we had the complement system that formed this pore that poked a hole in the cell? Well, perforin is kind of the same thing. So it's going to create a hole in the side of the cell. And then what happens is it's going to release granzyme, which is a digestive enzyme. And then that granzyme is going to go through those little holes that it created. And so it's going to enter the infected cell and basically start eating away at the cell. So it's going to destroy the cell from inside out. So it's telling the cell, the infected cell, we're shutting you down, we're inactivating you, we're basically destroying you. Okay. So when a T cell, a cytotoxic T cell finds an infected cell, it will poke a hole in it and then dump the chemical into it to destroy the cell, thereby killing it. And that's the way it works. So cytokines, if you look at page 6, letter C, number 4, it says cytokines are secreted. There should be, let's just say, secretions that help amplify the immune response. And so we can see that a category of cytokine are actually the interferons, which we talked about before. And we saw some interleukins mentioned when we were talking about the activation of the T cells and the B cells. And you can see what they do here. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just as a reference, there are all these different types of chemicals that help amplify the immune response. So again, just to go through the roles of the T cells, on page 6, letter D, we have the helper T cells. So they stimulate the proliferation of other T cells and the B cells that have already found the antigen. Cytotoxic T cells kill other cells that are infected. We also have regulatory T cells. We haven't talked about those, but those release cytokines that will actually calm down the B cells and T cells. So it kind of keeps them in check. Doesn't let them get out of control. But the thing is, as I said before, the helper T cells are important. They're like the confirmer. They confirm and kind of give the go-ahead. So if you didn't have your helper T cells, you wouldn't have a functional adaptive immune response because the helper T cells get everybody activated. I love this picture because they say it's a simplified summary, and I mean sarcastic here, facetious. A simplified summary of the primary immune response, and then they hit you with all this stuff. But what they're trying to show you here in this picture, just to help simplify it for you, it all starts here at the antigen. And if an antigen makes its way past the surface barriers and affects the internal environment, whether it's through the innate defenses or whether it's the adaptive defenses, it's going to initiate the immune system response. So we talked about the internal defenses, innate defenses, interferon, the complement system, fever, inflammation, phagocytosis, natural killer cells. We talked about all those, okay? But if we introduce that antigen to the adaptive defenses, we engulf the antigen through a dendritic cell, which is in the periphery, right? Exposed to the environment. And then it presents the cell. It's going to activate the CD4 cell, which is going to become a helper T cell, which is going to help activate the CD8 cells so that they can become the cytotoxic T cells and go after the infected cells. Helper T cells are also going to interact with the B cells that have come into contact with the antigen, giving them confirmation to become active so that they can make plasma cells or differentiate into plasma cells that secrete the antibodies, but also to produce the memory cells. So that's essentially what's happening here. But really revolves around those helper T cells. The helper T cells are very important. Because they make it work. So this table here, 21-7, gives you a nice breakdown of the different cells of the immune system and what they do, what their function is. So it's a really nice summary for everything that we've talked about here today. As far as the adaptive immune response, it's really, really helpful. So this would be a great one to refer to if you need to reference any of these while you're doing your assignments or working on anything. Lastly, we just have the concept to talk about, just briefly talk about organ transplants and prevention of rejection. So obviously the best organ transplant is for someone who's an exact match genetically, all right? So for example, you graft tissue from one part of your body and put it in another place in your same body, that's perfect. If you're lucky enough to have an identical twin, that would be okay for a transplant. Next best would be a family member who shares similar genetics to you, okay? But that's not always the case. We don't always have that luxury when we're talking about transplanting organs. So just very briefly, at the end of the notes, I have different types of grafts or transplants. We start with the autograft. That's the best one. That's the one that's tissue from one person going to that same person. Okay, so for example, if you have surgery and you take a tendon or ligament from somewhere and you transplant to another place in the body, there you go. The isograft would be a genetically identical individual, such as an identical twin. That's the next best thing. And then the most common is an allograft, what we call an allograft. So you take an organ from a human being and put it in another human being, but they're not genetically identical. So here's where we run into problems, because you're taking someone who has a different MHC and introducing it into another person's body. So now the body's immune system is going to want to attack that foreign organ. So that's why people who receive organ transplants have to go on immunosuppressive drugs to suppress the immune system, but that also has negative effects in other places. We also have xenografts. So these are also done from time to time. You take a graft from another animal species, so like valve from a pig, for example, heart valve from a pig. You can put a pig valve in someone. That's called a xenograft. So the idea here is the more closely you can get a genetic match from the donor to the recipient, the better the success is going to be for the transplant and the less likely it's going to be to reject. Because the more identical genetically a person is to another, the closer that MHC complex is going to be. Okay. So just as a review, as a once over, could you tell me what some of your body's innate defenses would be? What would you categorize as an innate defense that you're born with?
Skin.
Skin. And mucous membranes. You got it. Exactly. Okay, what else? Yep. So that's the first line of defense. You mentioned that. So now if a pathogen gets past or gets through the skin or gets through the mucous membrane, now we have to have non-specific structures that are there to, excuse me, that are there to help stop the pathogen from proliferating. So what do we have? Yeah, the phagocytes. So they're going to engulf the pathogen. There might be an antigen presenting cell and present it to the adaptive immune system. What's another example of an innate defense that's internal? A lot like the cytotoxic T cells, but they're not specific. Yeah, the natural killer cells. Yeah, exactly. They do the same thing as a cytotoxic T cell, except they're not specific. They'll just look for something that doesn't belong, a cell that's infected, and they go after it. And then what are some other things that we have? We talked about like two more specifically. One's like the one, if you infect a cell, like I said, it's like the bank robbery. What's that one? The virus infects a cell and it releases a chemical that lets the other cell know that there's an infection, so it blocks the virus replication. What's that one called?
Antimicrobial. Inflammation.
Nope, it's not inflammation.
Antimicrobial.
It's an antimicrobial protein. Yeah, it's the interferon. Yep, you got it. So you're right. What's the other antimicrobial protein process? The complement. Yeah. So complement is going to help enhance inflammation, but it's also going to poke a hole in the cell. Yep. And then we have the other two that are left. Inflammation. Is that the one you mentioned?
And fever.
And fever, yeah. And what are the four cardinal signs of inflammation? Redness, heat, swelling,
Pain.
and pain. You got it. Nice. Okay, and then we get to the specific adaptive immune response. So what are the two different types of lymphocytes in the body? B cells and T cells, right? Two families. We have the B lymphocytes and the T lymphocytes. The B cells, the T cells. Where are they born? They're born in the bone marrow, and where do they go to school? Think of the first letter, B for bone. So they stay in the bone marrow, okay? B cells stay in the bone marrow. T cells are born where? Not born in the thymus. They're born in the bone marrow, and they go to the thymus for school. So both the T cells and B cells are born in the bone marrow. T cells leave and go to the thymus. B cells stay there. Got it? So then the T cells get trained in the thymus, and they have to go through the positive and negative selection. Remember that? So they have to make sure they recognize the MHC complex, the self MHC, right? So they have to recognize that it's a fellow soldier on the same side. Okay. But then they also have to go through negative selection. So that way when you hold up a picture, they're not going to think that that picture means that you should kill them, right? If I hold up a picture of the bad guy, you say, okay, I know that, Victor, you're holding up a picture of the bad guy. This is the one we have to go after. You have to make sure that the T cell does both of those things. Otherwise, you're going to have an autoimmune problem. Okay. So the B cells, they fight an infection where? What kind of immunity does that give us? Within the body's, the old term, or body's fluids, what kind of immunity? Humoral immunity. That provides us with humoral immunity. So when you activate a B cell, it's going to differentiate into the plasma cells and the memory cells. The plasma cells secrete antibody. Remember that? Okay. So when the B cells become active, they differentiate into either a memory cell or a plasma cell. The plasma cell secretes antibody to kind of slow down the progression of whatever has the antigen. You got it, or you have a question? You're good? Okay. Those are the B cells. T cells, we have T cells, and they provide what kind of immunity? Not humoral, but cell and cell combat, so that's called cellular. Cellular immunity. Yep, humoral immunity and cellular immunity. Those are the two different types. So the T cells provide cellular immunity, and we have two different categories. We have the CD4, and we have the other one, which is the CD8. Yeah. So CD4 cells become what kind of cell?
Helper cells.
Helper T cells, and they activate the B cells, the T cells, macrophages. They get things going, right? And then the CD8 cells become what? Yeah, the cytotoxic T cells. And what do the cytotoxic T cells do?
They kill.
They kill infected cells. Yes. So that, my friends, is a summary of everything we talked about today. understand that, you got a pretty good grasp on what we went through today. What questions do you have for me before we call it a day? Anything you think of?
I don't think I can think of any questions.
Okay, that's all right.